The American Quilt Study Group presents Quilts in a Material World. Episode 1, What is Material Culture? Presented by Susan J. Jerome. Susan J. Jerome is the Collections Manager at the University of Rhode Island Historic Textile and Costume Collection and the Curator Registrar for the University of Connecticut M. Estelle Sprague Costume Collection. She earned her MS degree from the University of Rhode Island, focusing on textile and clothing history. Ms. Jerome sits on the National Board of the American Quilt Study Group and the Costume Society of America Northeastern Region Advisory Committee. She writes and lectures on topics of clothing and needlework history.
Hi, everyone. My name is Susan Jerome, and I am delighted to be the first presenter in a series put on by the American Quilt Study Group titled Quilts in a Material World. I think for me, this quote says quite a bit about what quilts mean to women's history and to the history of people in general, particularly in the 19th and early 20th centuries. And this is one of the reasons why I am very passionate about quilts and quilts history, is that a quilt can tell you so much about a person's life, where they lived, their economic status, perhaps some of the things they enjoyed in life and such, all in the little pieces of fabric that they might have stitched together at those odd moments that they could find in their lives. So we're going to begin with a little discussion of what a material culture is. Material culture really looks at everyday items. It goes beyond looking at history from the perspective of the famous or political boundaries or battles that were fought. Material culture looks at a group of people by looking at their ordinary things, the things that they made, the things that they used in their lives that could be dug up from the ground or found in an inventory list. The ordinary is something that James Dietz talks about in his book, In Small Things Forgotten, which is one of the first books published on material culture studies in the 1970s. What is a material culture study? It's a bit of an adventure. It asks the questions of who, what, when, where, why, and how. And it explores the ways in which, if you're looking at a quilt, the quilt was made, from what it was made, who may have made it, who may have used it, how was it used, and then finally asks the question, what does it mean to us today? It's a way of exploring the stories that are behind an object. And for us who are quilt historians, quilt fanatics, it's a way to look at the stories behind the material of the quilt. Questions to ask, and you can see them listed here. Who made the quilt? Do you know when it was made and who used it? All the way down to, can you find other contemporary examples of the quilt that may help to look at it as a comparison? Is it very unique, or is it a log cabin based on a, dare I say, typical log cabin quilt? Finally, a material culture study looks at, what does the quilt mean to us today? Is it in a collection? Is it considered monetarily valuable? The reasons for a quilt's existence today is really part of the history of the piece. Provenance is a way to start, and we're going to look a little bit at this particular square that you see on the right. You see it has a name on it, Mary Eleanor Bristow, and you can see that it is unfinished. This quilt came to the University of Rhode Island unfinished. It was given by what we think is the maker's granddaughter. It's supposed to be a baby quilt, and a series of blocks that have names that have been embroidered on them. When you look at Mary Eleanor Bristow's name, you can see that it has been written onto a piece of paper with her birth date to be used as a pattern for embroidering her name and the date onto a piece of fabric. It's very nice to have a quilt that has names and dates on it. All of the names and dates are of boys and girls living in the southern Rhode Island area, and their birth dates fall between 1912 and 1916. So this gives us a pretty good idea as to where the quilt was made and when it was made. Now, I could look into Google, look in the internet, and find many of the men still existing, doing things throughout the early 20th century, find their grave sites in some of the graveyards in southern Rhode Island. It's much more difficult to find the women. Why? Because they change their names when they get married, and they're more likely to move away from Rhode Island. However, Mary's somebody whom I could find. One of the nice things about a material culture study is it can take you down a path and lead you to actually being able to see a person. The unfinished baby quilt, dated around 1915, made with red and white cotton fabrics, embroidered with the names of children between 1912 and 1916. Mary was easy to find because she never married and she never moved away from southern Rhode Island. So we have on the right her graduation picture, and then on the left the picture that I could capture from her obituary. Curatorial information can help in a material culture study. This is a quilt that came into URI, having passed through 5 different people before it actually was donated to the university. It's a spider web or cobweb quilt that you can see. And I suspect one of the reasons why it was kept is because it was made by William Strange. There was a newspaper article that you can see on the right, dated September 1929. Mr. Strange hand sewed the quilt, has several thousand pieces in it, and he entered it into a local fair in Connecticut and apparently won a prize. These kinds of stories are part of looking at a material culture, studying a piece, gathering up information about the quilt, which leads us to the people behind them. A material culture study involves the physical characteristics, and you can look at those first when you're doing a material culture study. So if you're looking at a quilt, you're going to look at the dimensions. Is it pieced? Is it appliqued? You can see the quilt on the right here is our blocks that are set on point, which is something very typical for a Rhode Island quilt. There's no border around it. There's no sashing. Again, these are characteristics of Rhode Island quilts. Once you gather all the information together, the physical information together, that's the beginning of a material culture study. Then you can perhaps look at some of the physical characteristics. One of the things that it's fun to do is to try to identify the fibers from which a quilt can be made. Often in the 19th century, you have your choice of 4 different kinds of fibers. The upper left with the sort of knobs and the striations that you see on those fibers, that's a flax fiber from which linen is made. On the right, the upper right is a wool fiber with its very recognizable scales. That wool fiber has been chewed by insects, so you can see the little bites taken out of the end. Below it, the spiral fiber is cotton, perfect cotton spiral that you can look for when you look under a microscope. Next to it on the left is silk. Silk is probably the one fiber that we see that has very little characteristics to it. They look just like glass rods. But you want to identify, if you can, the fibers of the top, the batting, the backing, even the sewing thread and the quilting threads to see what they're made out of. That's part of a material culture study. The fabrics. Are they printed cottons, silks, ribbons, and such? The ribbon that you see in the lower left-hand corner is dated 1885. And there were several ribbons in this particular quilt that was donated to the university that have Freemason ribbons from Norwich, Connecticut, 1884, 1885, which gives us a good idea not only of the dating of the quilt, of course it's a crazy quilt, so that is another clue, but also gives us an idea as to where the quilt would have been made originally, around the Norwich area. Unfortunately, this quilt was donated in 1956 by a Mrs. Mervyn Miller, and the person accepting the quilt into the university's collection didn't think to ask her what her name was. And I cannot yet find a Mrs. Mervyn Miller, either in Rhode Island or in Connecticut. So I'm still looking for her name and her information, because apparently this quilt came through her family to the university. On the right-hand side, you see this bright chrome yellow, which is very indicative of textiles from the printed cottons from the early part of the 19th century, 1830s, 1840s. And below it, you can see the blue that progresses downward to the brown fabric right below it. Again, this ombre print, which is very typical of printed cotton fabrics from the 1830s and 1840s. So these are clues as to when this particular quilt would have been made. This is an interesting quilt given to the university. As you can see, it's on point, just blocks, no sashing, no edging, very typical of quilts in Rhode Island at the time. The red fabric is quite fascinating because it looks like, as you can see, a toile. These fabrics with the large, often printed scenes of famous people and places, or a pastoral scene, something like that. Very popular for bed hangings and curtains, other household textiles in the latter part of the 18th and early 19th centuries. So one of the graduate students at the university decided she was going to try to figure out what the toile pattern was. So she took a picture of all of the pieces of red, and then, like a jigsaw puzzle, put them together and found out that the original toile was this pattern here, which was produced in Nantes in France between 1788 and 1793. So this tells us that the quilt was made after that time, but the fact that somebody would have taken what would be an expensive fabric used for bed hangings, used to demonstrate your wealth in your house, somebody took that fabric and cut it up into little pieces, certainly suggests that the quilt was made years after that, when the bed hangings were no longer being used within the home for household furnishings. This quilt has other things to tell us as well. You look closely at it, it is in fact a quilt inside a quilt. Around the edges, you can see that there are bits and pieces of a different printed fabric inside. And when you look through a light, with a light in the back, you can see sort of a bit of the pattern. So this quilt, by looking at it closely, shows us that people were putting quilts, old quilts, inside a quilt, using that as a batting, using old textiles in order to, recycle, reuse, repurpose. Very modern ideas today. The backs of quilts are as interesting as the front. The front of this quilt, again, it's on point, no sashing, no edging. This variable stars from the 1830s has a much older fabric on the back. You can see across the top, the faded section suggests that the original pillar print might have been used as curtains, or certainly near a window where the sun faded the fabric. So rather than just dispose of it, because of course fabric would have been expensive at the time, the quilt maker decided to use it for the backing of this quilt. Look closely at your pieces. This particular quilt, we know, was made in Rhode Island, and it shows some interesting features, including what looks like a mistake in one of the brown single blocks. The scalloped edge line that you see suggests that this was a piece of fabric that was a second. It was discarded or would have been given away within a mill, because that's the edge of the printed cylinder, the cylinder as it went across the fabric to print it, to turn it brown. So is this fabric a second from a mill? Which leads us to ask the question, was this made by someone who worked in a mill at the time, who could take the fabric home and then just turn it into a quilt, use it as a quilt? This particular quilt has other interesting features to it. If you look at the floral patterns, you can see that there are at least 2 different colorways there, which again suggests this particular quilt was made by somebody who could gather together seconds from their place at which they worked and take it home and make a quilt out of it. So the unfinished quilts can be as fun as the finished ones. This is one of 3 English paper-pieced quilts tops that we have at the university, all from the same family. And the papers inside date from the late 1700s through to the 1930s. The unfinished tops have on the front of them fabrics that date from probably the 1830s, but then also into the 1930s as well. So we believe that the unfinished quilts were begun in Charleston, South Carolina, brought back to Rhode Island, and then another family member started to take them apart, put them back together and such in the 1930s. They came to us in the 1950s. There's a really interesting history to this piece, and it's shown on the back of the quilt. Why quilts are made? Well, sometimes we know, sometimes we don't know. The pocket that you can see on the left was certainly made for convenience. And it's a lovely little pieced bit of patchwork, not quilted, but certainly has a lovely variety of printed cottons onto it. The quilt in the middle was made by a woman who we know sewed for a living. After her husband, she made this quilt early in the 1860s. She married, her husband went off to war, the Civil War, and never came home. And she supported herself partly by sewing for people. The quilt on the right is a baby quilt. Latter part of the 19th century, it is small. It's appliqued as well as pieced. I'm not quite sure I would want to put a baby on it. We do know that it was made for a baby, but it really is more in celebration, perhaps something practical to use for a baby. But that, in some ways, is just my opinion. The word quilt is quite interesting because it is both a noun and a verb. Quilts historically have been used to cover beds. They've been used to provide perhaps something for friends that are traveling distances. We all know about signature quilts and how they can be made by a group of people if somebody is moving away or to celebrate a birth or a wedding, something such as that. They certainly can be displays of a person's technical abilities. They can be ways to relieve stress. I mean, think of the ways that people use quilting today to become artistic, to create things, to have something to do with their hands. Quilts can be made from published designs, and those started in the latter part of the 19th century in women's publications such as Godey's Lady's Book. It can be individual works of art as well. Quilts are just such a way to express oneself and to learn about people in the way that they express themselves. Many things affect quilt making. The technology, of course. We all know about the invention of the cotton gin and what that did to the manufacturing of cotton products in this country early in the 19th century. Technology also includes such things as the dyeing processes. 1856, the development of the first synthetic dye in England opened up a whole new world of colors in the 19th century. Economics plays a factor as well. Politics also. As a senator from South Carolina said in 1858, no power on earth dares make war on cotton. Cotton is king. Well, we all know what happened after that. After that, all of these things affect manufacturing quilts, the making of quilts today, making of quilts in the 19th century. Quilts are multi-layered. They are utilitarian as well as can be looked on as a kind of artwork. This whole cloth quilt that we have in our collection is simply perhaps utilitarian, but someone took the time to express their creativity in the quilting pattern, which is again on point, just like the pieced patterns, the blocks that you see in Rhode Island quilts, both on point. It's a geometric pattern. It's not just straight lines. This consideration of an artifact brings the people who made and used quilts really to life. When you look at a quilt through a material culture study, it goes beyond just what it looks like. Is it pretty? Is it this, that? It goes into looking at the time and the place in which it was made. And then last thing to do when you look at a material culture study and you look at a quilt from various ways is to think about how the quilt, what it means to you today. There are a lot of resources, a lot of articles on quilting. You can go to such places as JSTOR. The Quilt Index includes all of the descriptive elements needed for looking at a material culture study. So it asks those questions such as what are the dimensions, what are the blocks, how is it made, da, 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 da. And you can go to that through just Googling the Quilt Index. It's a wonderful resource as well for looking up comparisons, for looking up lots of different information about how quilts can have different characteristics depending upon where they're made and such, the time period in which they're made. The American Quilt Study Group, we do a lot of wonderful things, which is why I'm here. The quilts that you saw are all at the University of Rhode Island. We have a historic textile and costume collection, and you're welcome to contact the university for more information. And finally, this is just a little bit, this is just a few of the books that you might want to look for in order to learn a bit more about quilts history, the textiles used in quilting and such. Thank you very much. Hope to see you soon.